Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you are accessing this recording. Now, this is lecture number 7. This is not a Monday because we lost Monday for a very good reason. It was International Women's Day. So this year's International Women's Day came at a cost of our lecture. But I did not want to break the rhythm of our module. So I thought to record this lecture so that our continuity progresses through the weeks. So as you can see, the camera is on a bit of odd angle because I'm not at Harvard Lecture Theater, which is on the 3rd floor. But this is a different room on the 2nd floor. Anyway, so welcome back. And I'm sure that most of you have had your seminars already with your seminar leaders this week. And the topic, the topic that we reviewed this week, whether you are with me or other seminar leaders, we were looking at internal and external business environment at the same time. Because there is no reason, particularly if you look at any textbook on business, there is no reason why we need to treat them separately, although they need to be understood separately, internal and external business environment. But if you're running an enterprise or if you're responsible for a particular section or particular department of your enterprise, we try to discuss and review and explore and investigate internal and external business environment together. So that's why I put internal business environment last week. And this week, the topic is external business environment. But at the seminars, you are reviewing both of them combined. So previously, this lecture should last about 50-55 minutes. So have a look at it when you can before the next lecture, which is on finance. So I'm supposing that some of you, if not all, or maybe most of you, would like to take the path of finance, financial econometrics, financial business, or just finance and accounting in the future. So as a part of this particular module, we'll spend 1 week looking at finance, and that's next week. So what I've also done is I'm going to invite a financial accountant. He's an expert. He has worked internationally across private sector, public sector, and also he does financial accounting on a regular basis. So he will be recording the lecture, and also I'll make it available as soon as possible. So that's the lecture for next week, and you will have a guest lecture. So I will not be delivering the next lecture, which is on finance, but I'll keep you updated via emails as I always do. So looking back, let's take a step back from last week. Previously, we looked at the internal environment of business and some of the key components that we discussed, starting with employees, particularly how do you keep your employees motivated? A motivated staff is a real asset for an organization, regardless of industry, regardless of sector, regardless of market. But also at the same time, motivated staff, motivated employees tend to last longer in an organization. Therefore, the organization's employee turnover ratio falls over time, which means that people actually want to work for their organization. So that's a good sign. That's a good sign for building their reputation. Because end of the day, whether you are furnishing a brand or sort of setting up a portfolio of your product lines, or if you are in different markets, what truly matters is your reputation. Reputation is the business that you're in. But also we looked at the importance of management, particularly the quality of leadership style, how leaders manage and organize or sort of solve crisis, how do they manage change, how do they support employee development, let's say human resource development. And at the same time, one of the components of internal business environment is culture. And we have been talking about culture since week 2. We talked about international culture, organizational culture, and also national culture. This becomes even more pertinent if you are a business based in your home country and you're planning to internationalize abroad in a host country, how important it is to actually understand, cultivate, and adapt to that particular host country's culture. So those were some of the aspects that we looked at when we reviewed the internal business environment. But also at the same time, we looked at some of the forces that shapes organization's internal competency, not just capacity, but also ongoing competency. So we started by looking at customer, who you're creating the value for, something that you understand very well, because in your presentations, I got a shade of that. That's the key. Who are you creating the value for? Then comes the quality of products and services that you're offering. And also the third one, which is very, very, very critical, is the location. Now, I took the example of Ibis Hotels in the last lecture. Ibis Hotels in Europe and also in the UK. Ibis Hotels are always next to the train station. That's one of their competitive advantages. Now, also, I want you to understand location doesn't have to be necessarily physical. So, for example, if you're an online business, you don't even have to be an online business. Let's say you are a consultant, business consultant, or you are good at plumbing. Let's take a very simple example. You're running a plumbing business. What you need to do, what you need to make sure is that you're visible. So if people search for, let's say, they go on Google and search for plumbers around me or plumbing services around me, or construction industry workers around me, whatsoever it might be. If you are a freelancer, if you're an independent worker, make sure that you actually show up on the search list. If you're not on the search list, you don't exist, no matter how good you are at your skills, at your job, at your competency, at your expertise. So that's key. And equally important for businesses, the physical location. You need to be found. That's fundamental. Also, at the same time, getting the philosophy right is critical, because when you look at mission statement, vision, and goals, all these are manifestations of the core philosophy or the core beliefs of an organization or any company. So those are some of the internal. So these are the factors. If you think about it, these are the factors you can somewhat control. Okay, so these are not forces that are sort of going to attack you from outside. These are things that you develop at home, in-house, that is within the organization, and you can control them, you can change them, you can nourish them, and you can add new components to it. Towards the end of the last lecture, I also looked at organizational structure. I'm just repeating because these are key terms to remember. And in organizational structure, we looked at the power dynamics, whether it's a formal organization or it's an informal organization. Do they have a vertical structure, horizontal structure? Do you think the decisions are taken at the top and then it sort of percolates down the levels? So there is a top-down approach, or some organizations might take a bottom-up approach. That means they tend to be a bit more participatory. They tend to be a bit more collaborative in approach. I also finally looked at organizational chart, which looks at, if you go back to the very first lecture, we looked at Japan, Korea, China, and how typical traditional organizations look like. Who controls the power, who reports to whom, how many line managers are there, what is the span of control, how many employees do you need to manage, and so on. So that's critical to know how the organizational structure and chart looks like. For most organizations, you can actually access it online. So you can actually see how the organizational chart is laid out and planned, and it's quite unlikely to change over time. Finally, we also looked at SWOT, strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats. And you might have noticed that SWOT is a very comprehensive tool. It might sound a bit vague because it's only 4 factors. It could be quite generic. But whether you use SWOT to make a generic analysis or a very specific analysis, that is entirely up to the individual or the organization who is doing it. So I have personally seen SWOTs that are very detailed, looks at both internal and external forces together. So you might find that some of the opportunities and threats are actually external, which might hit you in the long run, or your strengths and weaknesses are mostly from within. Now, one of the quotations that I used in the last lecture, if you remember, I was quoting Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, who said that great empires were once demolished, not because of the forces from outside, but from challenges emerging from within. So internal forces need to be equally controlled and monitored. So, but if you look at SWOT, this is what sort of brings the internal and external forces together, because some of the opportunities might actually be within the organization, not just as a market opportunity in a different market, but for example, if you've got talent working for you within the organization and you tend to ignore it. So if you've got the right resources under your command, but you still look for resources outside the organization. So that's a waste, yeah? So you might have resources that could be asset, but then you ignore it or don't pay equal value or appropriate value, so to speak, and then you look for the grass is green, as they say. But SWOT can bring both the factors together. Finally, one of the things that we explored further in the seminars, as you might have already experienced, is understanding a very basic, fundamental, but very hugely popular model of motivation developed by Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid, you might remember from your seminars, 5 levels, and basically trying to understand the needs, identifying the needs and trying to understand and then satisfy those needs in order to keep the employees motivated happy. And if the needs of the employees are satisfied, they tend to perform better. If they're performing better, the general level of productivity also goes up. Therefore, in the end, the final outcome or the final output is better and obviously higher. That's the working principle. Now, obviously, that's a bit debatable, because if you are super motivated, or if all your needs, desires, or wants are satisfied, some people might actually get less motivated over time rather than more motivated. So that's another sort of criticism of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But that's a model I really want you to remember, because in the course of next 3-4 years, you will come across Maslow's model repeatedly. So if you remember all the 5 levels, you can just use it in your discussions, business or otherwise, because it's quite true. Maslow did identify the needs quite rightly. So today, what we're going to do, largely something that is not entirely new, Pestel factors. And I have mentioned Pestel in my seminars over and over again. Some of you actually did Pestel for your presentation, which is great. Quite a few actually, if I remember correctly. But at the same time, every time I talk about Pestel, I just want you to remind yourself that this is not a tool. This is not a business model that tells you what to do if you have got a crisis within the organization. This model is just giving you a scan of your environment, business environment. So it tells you what is your current state, not how it should be or what it should be, but what it is, how it is. So depending on the results of the Pestel analysis, you get to decide what to do next. That's not the job for Pestel. You've got other models of strategic management, something that we will be discovering together in the next few weeks. But Pestel is vital, Pestel is indispensable, and Pestel is done by almost every single organization ongoingly. So this is not just once or twice a year, it's done thoroughly throughout the year, throughout the business product cycles, business cycles, economic cycles, non-stop, because they keep changing. They are all macroeconomic variables that are not under your control. So you need to know them, you need to be aware of them, and then you've got to make some changes or adaptations to your business as appropriate, as necessary. So that's something that we're going to spend quite a bit of time today in this particular lecture. The second thing we're going to review is the nature of importance of external environment affecting businesses, and how, let's say there's an economic change or a socio-cultural change, how does it affect the business's decision-making, organizational decision-making process. Finally, I hope that by the end of this lecture, you should be able to have some sort of ability to understand the importance of adapting a business to changing external circumstances. And some of the Pestel factors are factors. One or two of them might be considered as a force. For force, may the force be with you, that force, quite similar. For example, if it's an economic change, for example, they've got some laws passed on trade. So you're making a lot of profit by trading with some Latin American countries, but due to some changes in economic reforms, either in that market or over here in the CIS countries, there might be some trade restrictions, and you might have to change the way you run your international trade. Similarly, if there's a political change and there's regulation that you need to pay your workers a higher minimum wage than before, obviously that's no choice. You have to go for it. So those are sort of one-way traffic, which does change your business's decision-making, because you can't negotiate that. But fundamentally, if you're looking at Pestel, it's sort of a framework. So that's, if it's a framework, it helps you to sort of churn your information, give you an overview of things. It's sort of an input-output relationship. So this is what's happening. This is how I'm going to look like. What do I do next? So there are theoretical frameworks, even every social sciences, not just in business or economics. But Pestel is really a framework or a tool used by organizations to analyze and monitor. These two words are really, really important: analyze and monitor the macro environmental or external environmental, as putting it simply, that have an impact of an organization. But I would still encourage you to use the words macro environmental rather than external environment, because typically when you talk about external environment, it is not just the macroeconomic variables. It could be competitors, it could be buying power, it could be a large number of factors that are not necessarily macro variables. It could be other forces also. So that's the idea of Pestel. It's a framework that helps you to analyze and monitor. Those are the two things that it helps you to do, and that's it, pretty much, nothing more. So when you look at the, I'm not going by PESTEL, PEST. That'll be kindergarten. Let's just try to review them together, because one of the things that I want you to take away today is, although they are understood and identified separately, PESTEL, but in the end, if you understand the framework, they're all pretty much interdependent. All the factors are pretty much interdependent. So if there's a political change, the effects will be realized by some of the economic forces. And if there has been impact on the economic forces, societal changes might occur, leading to certain businesses taking specific decisions accordingly. So they are not independent, they are all connected. So let's start with the socio-cultural environment, because this is something that all of us are exposed to on a daily basis, and some of the things that organizations need to keep track on. So for example, population size, okay, birth rates, population distribution, but then also you have to go a little bit more in depth, try to understand what is the demographics of a country. Do you have young population, that is more than 50% of the population size? What is the level of education of the country? If the country is highly literate, if the country is very well informed of the international markets, and you're trying to launch a product in that market and you're trying to advertise it, what should be your strategy of marketing? What sort of language, what sort of communication you're going to introduce with your suppliers, consumers, and customers? So if it's a highly educated country, the language and also the way of strategic marketing communication will be different than if you are trying to enter a least developing country or least developed country. That will differ. So there is no one size fit all, and every country has got certain uniqueness in their markets, including some of these social cultural factors, education, level of education, degree of literacy. These things also matter in the way you communicate with your stakeholders, not just suppliers and customers, but a wide variety of stakeholders. I hope you remember the concept of stakeholder, because we spent quite some time distinguishing stakeholders and shareholders. I think this was a couple of weeks ago. Also, one of the factors that plays a strong role, which is religion. But I think every time there's a discussion on religion, people try to take the example of McDonald's and KFC, because you've got a different menu. You get a different menu in Europe, different menu in the Middle Eastern countries, different menu in China, and also elsewhere. But also, it's not just the food habits, but also some of the beliefs, some of the mindset, clothing, everything gets affected, because there are some core values that a society lives with. So that's sort of non-negotiable. So the only thing that business can do is to understand and adapt with them. So belief is a core system, and those sort of things are socially constructed also. Therefore, more you know some of the local context, more globalized you are, global localization combined, we call them globalization, then your stakeholders are happier. So let's try to get a little bit more in depth looking at the demographic factors here. If you look at the slide, a demographic environment fundamentally involves people, and people make up markets. Just like organizations, you've got people, individuals make up groups, and the groups make the organization. So some of the factors that come under demography, the study of demography, which is the study of human population, is age distribution, ethnic and racial groups, and also household patterns. So if it's let's say a well-knit, close family setting, let's say if you're selling the same automobile, same model in Europe, in Germany, you might have this very different model trying to sell it in China, because people might have different way of living in their household. So they might want to live with the parents, they might have an extended family, so you might have 7-8 members under one roof. But in certain other markets, you might have single families, so just a couple with their kids, and their parents and their extended family lives separately. So depending on that, it's not just for automobile, because I took the example of automobile. Quite a lot of examples are available from the automobile industry. So the same company might sell a sedan in China, but they might be selling a 2-seater in Germany, depending on the level of need and the nature of needs fundamentally. So, and again, getting back to the whole idea of education levels, because that truly counts. Education levels affects the way you advertise your products. I'll come to that because I've got an example coming up soon. Another aspect is the component of gender distribution, the balance between males and females, Then, sort of if you look at the second bullet point, if the population is aging and there is a decrease in younger population, then there will be a decrease in demand for education, child products, Marvel or simply comics, toys, and etc. That means if you're trying to enter, let's say, a country like Japan, where with, let's say, you're Lego, all right? So if you're Lego, or if you're Disney, or if you're selling comics, that's not a sort of a market you should be looking for the next 10, 15 years, because there's a decrease in younger population because of the falling birth rates in Japan. Whereas if you look at India or China, you've got a big percentage of the young population currently looking at the next 10, 20 years. So that's more profitable. So some of these demographic factors also matter. It's not just the consumer's power or consumer price index or purchasing power. What is the percentage of middle class or upper middle class living in the society, but also the age and gender distribution that counts. You also have to understand the market, because if you look at the, I just took the example of India and China when I was looking at younger population, increased percentage of younger population. So I've just given the example of Rock's $7 production. I don't know how many of you actually know it. This Rock is Dwayne Johnson, the same Rock who is in Jumanji, the movies, and lots of other movies that he has done over the years. And he set up this company called $7 Production. And by a large measure, a significant percentage of his movies sort of box office collection comes from China. Okay, so almost 5 or 6 times a month, he's seen to be in Beijing or in Shanghai, partnering with local organizations, local production houses in China, because that's where a significant percentage of his movies collection comes from. And probably the nature of the genre of movies that Rock generally tends to make. They sell pretty well in China. They sell pretty well in India. So he recognized some of the markets and expanded accordingly. So if you know the heartbeat, some of this demographic distribution, you might decide better. You might take better decisions of which product goes where and what is the future of this market for this particular product that I'm offering. And if I'm a diversified business, then I might be looking at different markets wherever it works best. So this is critical. Also, if you look at the gender distribution, if you look at age, you look at H&M kids, Abercrombie & Fitch kids, Zara kids, these product lines were not there initially when the companies actually started. Zara, basically had men and women, and then they added Zara kids. Zara also got Zara Home. But then also got Gap kids. Gap is another competitor for this market. So these are extended product lines or intrinsic diversification of these fast fashion industry, because there's a strong demand for it. But also I think I didn't add the example here because they don't really match well, go well with another one. It's Armani kids. That's another thing. But I don't think Armani actually fits well with H&M and Zara. Just to give an idea that the demographic profile might invite new product lines. So that's a good way to move your business forward. Here, this is the example that I was trying to, when I was looking at the educational levels. So I don't know if you know this brand Garber. I just thought to add a new example that some of you may not have heard of. If you have, that's great, because typically we tend to take examples that are already quite popular. So this is for a change. So when Garber started selling baby food products in Africa, they used the same packaging as they did in the US, with a beautiful Caucasian baby on the label. But then soon they learned that African companies most frequently put pictures of the ingredients of the label. So instead of the baby, put the ingredients of the label, since many people cannot read. So depending on the education level of the market, you might have to change your marketing communication channel or strategic marketing altogether, as you can see here. Another example, actually, the sort of the title that you're looking at right under Garber, cross-cultural branding, globalization. This is one of my articles. This was published last year, I suppose. And I've taken quite a few examples here. If you just type this name, it will show up on your Google, then you can read the full article for free. It's available online. And I've used quite a few examples there. And one of the examples that I've used was of Lux. I'm sure you're familiar with the brand called Lux, because toiletries, beauty and healthcare products. And when Lux was trying to enter the Chinese market, this was back in the 80s or 90s, they didn't change the they didn't understand globalization. So they were sort of going for this one size fit all policy, like Garber did also. But what the problem was, it's not just about the cultural context, but also the references, the cultural or the traditional references that you tend to make when you are advertising or making a slogan or something of that sort. Lux in Chinese meant a strong man. Okay, a strong man. That's what Lux means. And the advertisement that Lux was using in China was the same that they were using back in the US. And the advertisement was a woman was in her bathtub taking a shower, and she says that I only use Lux. Okay, I don't need to do the translation. Do it by yourself. That didn't go well. Okay, that didn't go well. So they had to change the whole language. They had to change the whole, the setting. The advertisement is a bit too exotic for the Chinese culture at that time, at that point in time, when the country was pretty closed. And that's a very standard Western advertisement, as we understand. So these factors came into being, the level of education, also the cultural orientation. These factors play a dominant role. So have a look at this article. There's quite a few other examples that I've used of Coca-Cola and quite a few others. So there's one, I think Pepsi made an advertisement. The slogan was Pepsi brings you back in life. Pepsi brings you back to life, which basically translated in Chinese, it meant Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. Okay, not very nice. Yeah. So those sort of it's not just the culture, as I was saying, it's not just the cultural references or norms, but also the whole context of the international market, the social cultural factors. Some of the things that I just mentioned before in the previous slide also counts together. So the next one is T from the PESTEL, technological environment. And one of the primary job, let's say, of technological advancement, it doesn't have to be necessarily innovation. It could be a simple technological advancement. It's trying to reduce the cost of making existing products. So naturally, these days, when people talk about technological advancements, you are probably thinking about innovation, coming just straight looking at something entirely new or something that's entirely path-breaking, going to disrupt the entire supply chain, etc. But that's not always the case. Sometimes technological advancements are necessary to reduce the cost of making existing products, so being more efficient, so to speak. Because customers are after the concept of value in terms of time, quality, price, and so on. How do you survive in a globally competitive market if you have got no control over your cost? But also, technology refers to the new methods of communicating with customers and suppliers. So just the way the B2B2C works in e-tails these days, quite different than how businesses communicate with one another, not just with customers, but also other businesses back in the 80s or 90s. So I've just underlined those 2 bullet points if you look at the slide, because most of the time technological advancement means these 4 rather than necessarily new or better products, which is obviously necessary, but that's not be all and end all of technological environment. You need something more. So fundamentally, as you can see, technological advancement is, in the end, it's just providing a value for customers through technology. So today, one of the benefits is convenience. How easily can you get an order delivered to your doorstep? And the question is, who is going to deliver this to me faster? End of the day, they are all providing the same or very, very similar product or service. The question is, who is going to get to you faster? Who is more accessible? And then there are matters of privacy and trust that comes later. That's one of the side effects of technological advancement, because if you look at the next slide, for example, this is it's a very common picture in China. If you look at Alibaba's warehousing, similar to Amazon's warehousing facilities also, these are not managed by human beings of flesh and blood. These are all managed automatically by artificial intelligence, and you've got these robots running the warehousing facilities. Also, the other one, I think I had one of the presentations from one of my seminar groups. I don't know, maybe there are other groups who also did it. And the particular group was trying to come up with this business proposition of delivering food via drones, which is a great idea and also probably the future as it happens. But then you probably know about the whole story of Huawei's story a couple of years ago in the US. I think it was last year, how drones invited new discussions around privacy and rights and so on. So technological advancements comes at a cost. These are great innovation, simplifies our life, makes access to products and services more convenient. That's all good. But then there are privacy and other issues that comes up that we also need to equally address, not just the positive advantages, but also the downsides of these technologies. One of the indicators whether the organizations are actually doing well or how committed they are towards technological advancement is what is the percentage of your annual revenue that you're investing on R&D, research and development. For a country, however, so for an organization, you look at what is the percentage of annual revenue you're investing on new R&D. But for a country, you can also look at what percentage of GDP, the gross domestic product, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, indicator of a country's growth, not necessarily development, but growth. How much of that is actually spent on technological improvements in a given country? So that's one of the indicators just to say whether this country is actually sort of committed towards technological advancement. Again, don't always mix up technological advancement with innovation. That's just one of the components. But as you saw in the previous slides, there are 4 factors or 4 components that technology actually brings. So this is a slide number 9. So moving forward, this is just a chart showing you how much companies actually spend on R&D, research and development. On the top, you get to see Amazon, and then you got Alphabet. I'm sure you know the company Alphabet because they own Google and related services. Alphabet is the parent company. And they've got Intel, Microsoft, and so on. This sort of data, this sort of charts actually helps us to unlearn some of our assumptions, because some of us might have assumed that Apple or Ford or Oracle should have been on the top because just the way they have been over the past several decades. But that's not the case. Amazon and Alphabet turns out to be at the very top. So play with the statistics because it really helps to gather a newer understanding, not just knowledge, but also an understanding of it. Another aspect of technological advancement is the new formation of electronic e-businesses or e-commerce, which is a technology mediated exchange between parties, individuals, organizations, or both, B2C, B2B2C, or C2C even, as well as electronically based intra or inter-organizational activities that facilitate such exchanges. This is one article I published. This was, again, I suppose last year, yeah. And the name of the article is Your Order Has Arrived. Enter Tomorrowland of the Gig Economy. This is also available online. So here I was just trying to explore a bit more about how these platforms facilitate the transactions of the business sort of relationship between the different stakeholders and how convenient it has become. Also some of the risks associated with it. So it's a short article. It should take about 10-15 minutes to read it, but it will explore how the e-businesses have benefited from such platforms as we use them on a daily basis, and the apps that keeps your phone busy and drains your battery. So some of the categories of e-businesses I just wanted to show you once again. So you've got B2B, so business to business, and then consumers to business, which is C2B. And then you've got businesses originating from businesses to customers, that's B2C, directly selling to the customers. And then you've got customers to customers. So if you take a dealership, for example, and you buy something in load or in lump sum, and you have to find other customers who are not necessarily end customers, but also they are consumers for you. They're going to take a part of what you have bought, a certain percentage. Let's say you've got 100 items. You don't have to sell 100 items to the end customer. You can sell 20 items to the end customers, and the remaining 80, you try to find other consumers. They're going to buy it from you, and then they're going to find customers of their own. So for each one of those transactions, you might get a finder's fee, as they call it. Finder's fee, you get a certain commission. And more consumers you find, your reputation, also the scale of your business grows. C2C is one form of business, but also the standard one is B2B, as you understand them. These are the 4 categories of e-business or e-commerce as we know it today. But there are a bit more. So this model is 2 by 2, but I'll show you the 3 by 3 matrix also, B2B to C, B2C to B2B, other models in the seminars in the following weeks. But for now, just to get started, if this is the first time you're looking at these concepts, just to get your head around these concepts will be really a good start. The next one is political environment, which sounds pretty direct, but let's start with the right-hand side column, classifications, home country. So refers to a country in which the parent company is based and from which it operates. So that's, sort of, let's say a Korzinka business like Korzinka based in Uzbekistan, and it is a Uzbek organization. But then if you're internationalizing, let's say Korzinka wants to start their operations in China, and China becomes their host country. So Uzbekistan is a home country, China becomes their host country. So host country is a country in which the foreign companies are allowed to do business in accordance with its government policies and within its laws. Now, I took the example of Korzinka, but it becomes slightly more complicated if you take the reference of a banking or financial organization, because banking laws and financial laws are pretty strict in countries, and if you're expanding your operations across different lands, then each one of those markets will have a very different set of laws and customs and government policies that you need to adhere with and also comply with. So businesses are not sort of disconnected to political influences. Let's look at some of the factors when you look at political environment. So the political factors have the power to change your outcome or business results, because it can also affect government policies at local to federal levels, so central, local, and state levels. And companies should be ready to deal with local and international outcomes of politics. So if, for example, if there's an embargo with a country, that means that country cannot trade with you anymore, then you have to find other markets where you can expand and continue your operations in. But quite a few factors here. For example, political decisions can influence countries' socio-cultural environment also. They can also influence the rate of emergence of new technologies. If the government suddenly decide to invite, sort of a big investment in R&D in the form of FDI, foreign direct investment, then you have to start working with foreign strategic partners, and then you get to know a little bit more about the R&D, and then in the process there's a technology transition that takes place, and the outcome is you become more knowledgeable, you become a bit more updated in your R&D. So there's a technology transfer that takes place if you are working closely with a technology partner, strategic technology partner. Politicians can also influence acceptance of new technologies. So some markets were previously not allowed to import certain technology of some scale, and now they are. Equally important, there were some markets where, for example, the Chinese solar power technologies were extremely popular, but they were not just popular, they were so cheap that they were killing the local sellers, local manufacturers. So some countries blocked or just said no, or put a quota on the Chinese manufacturers. Then they had to go and look for other markets where they could do business. So again, this is not much of a debate because it's already decided. So politicians or political decisions can actually affect the way your business decisions actually work. So that's one last point that I wanted to make. This is a slide for you takeaway. So just have a look later on, and I've given you quite a few factors here. So for example, if you've got trade control and tariffs, freedom of the press, some of the things that I mentioned, and then also you've got employment laws, discrimination law, data protection laws. If you are a company like Facebook or Twitter these days, you're having a pretty hard time because most of the countries are coming up with their own GDPR, General Data Protection Rights, and that changes the way your data accessibility and the way you sort of decrypt the information works because there are new laws in place. And there's quite a few others. Government's involvement in trade unions and agreements, import restrictions on quality and quantity of products that might stop the way some of the transfers or technology transfer or trade works. So have a look. And for each one of them, you can find lots of examples also online. So that will be a plus. This one, I don't want to spend too much time because I think with most of our seminars, we end up discussing quite a lot on sustainability. I was sitting in the presentations last week and almost, if not all, quite a lot of the presentations were very much environmental conscious. Quite a few times I heard the word sustainability. Quite a lot of time I heard business ethics and how green our organization is, how do you reduce your carbon footprints, and so on. So that's quite a lot of what has been done in this particular area. I have written, I don't know, over 30 articles on sustainability, environmental economics, climate change, particularly sustainability being a core area. So that's one of the things I would like to add here. It's not on the slide, but I just want you to take away. If you go and search Fair Trade Foundation. Fair Trade Foundation, you will see what they do. It's a really interesting area of discussion. Companies like Starbucks, particularly in the beverage and cotton industry, they try to get a certificate from Fair Trade Foundation, which basically means that you're not exploiting any stakeholder in your entire supply chain. So Starbucks might be charging a price for their coffee, which is higher than everyone else in the market. But at the same time, are they paying the cocoa bean farmers, so the coffee farmers, well enough? Or are they being exploited in the forests of Honduras, Chile, or Colombia? Okay, so if they apply, they actually got it. Starbucks is a member of Fair Trade Foundation. So on the coffee cups or anything that you buy from Starbucks, on the packaging, you get to see a logo of the Fair Trade Foundation, which looks a bit like the Chinese yin yang symbol. And it's in black and white, it's colored, that's the only difference. And it basically means any product which will have a Fair Trade Foundation logo does not harm or exploit any of their stakeholders in the supply chain. So everybody has been paid fairly, nobody got exploited, and then they are charging whatever they want from us, who are the end customers. Also, at the same time, some companies need to make sure that they're not leaving way too many carbon footprints. So the CO2 emissions have to be reduced over time. So for example, Procter & Gamble was one of the first companies who came up with this whole research. This was back in 2007. They decided that they identified that back in the US, people were washing clothes they were washing laundry, or they were washing clothes in hot water. They were washing clothes in hot water that contributed towards 90 billion CO2 emissions every year, additional 90 billion CO2 emissions every year. So they thought that if we can come up with a product that could wash clothes in cold water, you can just say goodbye to those extra 90 billion CO2 emissions every year, which they did. So they came up with Ariel and Tide. These products are hugely popular. You get to see this even in Corzinka, Tide and Ariel. And then started the whole industry of, a lot of competitors tried to do the same. And now washing clothes in cold water is the normal thing, right? So we don't really talk necessarily about washing clothes in hot water anymore. So you need only one player who can disrupt the industry, and then everybody follows suit once it's popular, accepted, and acknowledged. So that's one thing. Again, leaving less carbon footprints. That's the idea. So again, all these climate change discussions, sustainability, and also global warming, how it's caused. So I've got quite a few things on this slide. You can look at it, and you can go to YouTube and look for this documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. Okay, it tells you the whole story of global warming and how fast we are running out of water, the temperatures are rising, oceans are rising, how is it impacting us on a day-to-day life, not just in the long term, but it's happening now, what are the current threats, and so on. But there's an impact on consumer demand. So for businesses, that's important. So most of the customers these days, including yourself, are very environmental conscious. You care about sustainability, you care about the environment. So if more and more consumers are demanding that the products that they buy are sourced ethically and are not harming any stakeholder or not harming the environment, and if it's from a sustainable source, you're more likely to go and do transactions with those companies rather than others. So that's one of the things that they want to sell. And sort of if you look at the website, sometimes they say we are a member of the UN Global Compact, United Nations Global Compact, or we care about the Sustainable Development Goals, because these have been developing internationally for quite many years now, and organizations try to be a part of them because customers care. Customers are much more conscious and aware of these things today. So that's another way of creating value, not just what you offer in terms of the product quality or the price, but also the environmental consciousness and how responsible you are as an organization. Not just chasing profit, but also planet. I think one of the articles that, again, this is, I can't remember, I wrote this one 2 years ago. You could just type triple bottom line. It says planet, people, profit. So planet, people, and profit, they can all go hand in hand simultaneously. So you don't have to make profit over the planet. You can care for all the stakeholders and still be a business operational successfully. Okay, so that's just a picture to show you, if you don't believe in climate change, that is actually happening. This is how dry some parts of the world has become over the years, in a very short span, really. Okay, and there's some other climatic factors just for your information. Towards the end, I'm just going to wrap up with the economic environment because this is fundamental. Every time we talk about economic environment, we talk about the buying power of the customer, purchasing parity, what is the percentage of middle class of the total population, affordability, taxation, subsidies, and so on. But fundamentally, what is economics? And most of the time I have this conversation, people say economics is studying money. No, it's not. Fundamentally, if I have to simplify 20,000 books written on economics, it's trying to meet unlimited human needs with scarce resources. Yeah. So the human needs are unlimited, but the total resources are limited. So that's a struggle. That's a whole art and science of economics, is how to meet the unlimited human needs with scarce resources. But also at the same time, how an economic environment can be referred to as an external economic factor or external factor for a business is because it influences buying habits of customers and businesses and therefore affect the performance of a company. So purchasing power, for example. And largely when you look at economics, you've got two big branches, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Again, companies can't control the economic environment, but they can evaluate economic conditions before choosing to enter a particular market. So there might be industries which needs extra subsidy or less taxation. The government decides to boost a certain industry because it has been lagging behind, and you are trying to come up with a product or service that fits that particular industry. It might actually work for you. So just to be aware of those factors really changes the way your business can see a brighter day. So that's one. That's some of the factors why economic environment matters. There's so many things that we can look at. So I've just listed some of the factors for your understanding, because I'm sure you're following what I'm saying, but at the same time, some of the keywords must not be lost. So macro factors, including employment, unemployment, income level, inflation rates, interest rates from the banks, and then you've got tax rates, savings rates, recession. You got to check if I want to enter the market next year. Do you think they're running through an economic cycle now? If there's a recession going on, should I enter the market at this stage? Should I wait? Or maybe this is the right time to enter the market because tomorrow might not get better necessarily. So, you had a pandemic last year. It's still going on now, very much so. But then it's not going to be just over within a couple of months' time. It's just going to continue for at least a couple of years. So the following impact of a crisis could be severe. So according to those analyses, how many people lost their jobs, how many businesses shut down, what is the new tax rates, what are the interest rates of a bank, and so on. So these things can affect the way your business's decisions are taken. Again, on the other hand, you've got micro factors. For example, size of an available market. How many firms are there in a given industry? If there are too many firms, there's no point in entering because the size of the cake is limited. Yeah. But if the industry is new and not very matured, quite a few firms can still enter and make it work for them and also for the development of the industry. And then the nature of competition, availability and quality of suppliers, what sort of relationships you can create with the local suppliers, and so on. So both micro and macro factors, quite a lot, as you can see, compared to. That's why I kept this for the last discussion part, because other factors that we discussed didn't have this many factors to consider. So economic environment alone takes up quite a significant amount of time for the consultants who are analyzing Bestel to give you an overview of the current market. So have a look at these slides and see what are the thoughts that comes to your head, and which ones would you be looking for if you are starting to do a Bestel analysis for one of your business ideas. I hope the business ideas that you presented last week get to see the light of day one day. So eventually you will need to analyze these factors for your own development. Thank you very, very much for being with me today with this recording, really. So on Monday, we'll get to meet Dr. Andre. So I'll send you an email introducing him and his expertise areas. But please do revise the slides, because I add quite a lot of materials on LMS on top of our seminar files and lecture slides, because there's so much out there, and I've got to be careful which ones I share at your level. And slowly and steadily, I think over the weeks, we have developed quite a lot, and there's still quite a lot of miles to cover. So let's stay strong together, and let's build our understanding together. And I will see you next week. Take care. Take care. All the very best. Bye-bye.